You are now listening to Golden Hour, ambient music podcast. I'm your host, Collette, aka Gollden, and it is a pleasure to be running this podcast. Just a little bit about me before we get into things. I want to give a real good pretense for what this podcast is, what you can listen to and expect every single week, even though I don't really know even what to expect every single week, but you have to start somewhere. This is my very first podcast, and I'm excited to be talking about something that is very important to me, which is all things ambient music. So just a little background about me before we get into it. I've been performing under the name Collette Andrea for the majority of my life. I started playing music when I was about 14, and when I started playing, I actually started on bass guitar. And from there, I then learned drums, I then learned guitar, and all these instruments were self-taught. From the moment I started playing, I started writing. And from writing, I started exploring all kinds of different genres. For 10 years, I played mainly in bands, exploring rock, folk, acoustic musical genres. From there, I then built up many years of performing, playing in many different bands, and really got involved in the local Toronto and Canadian music scene. In addition to always being an artist and a musician, I had always enjoyed yoga and meditation. It had been very helpful and healing for me in my personal life, and it also added a lot of creativity to my life and supported a lot of my music and my journey. So while I was gigging and actively writing, releasing EPs and playing music, playing in bands, I also explored the more wellness and holistic side to myself, and I did a very first yoga teacher training back in 2014. After taking my teacher training, I then began to teach classes, and it was never my intention to teach, as I always thought of myself more as a performer, a writer, a musician. But naturally, I just started teaching and I ended up really liking it. I had always began teaching and guiding more therapeutic yoga classes, like yin yoga, restorative yoga, and then later came mindfulness meditation. My love for ambient music actually grew out of yoga. I spent so many years, so much time attending yoga classes, and there was some god-awful music played in them. And I don't know if you've ever been to a yoga class and everything's going fine, and then the teacher starts to play pop music. And that's okay if that's your preference for, you want a good workout, but yoga was never a workout for me, and it was more of a time to tune in and to shut off. So it's kind of sad to say, but my love for ambient music actually came out of a real hatred for bad music, in my opinion, which was played in classes. So then when I began starting to teach, I started to just look for music to play in my classes. And while there was some good ambient music out there, I didn't find that there was anything that really suited a really slow and inward practice like yin, restorative, and meditation. So out of this, I then began to just write my own music. And not only did I begin to write music, I very naturally started to learn how to produce and record music. And up until that point, I had no experience recording at all. I had recorded 2 previous EPs under my own name, but of course I had always worked with engineers and producers. So I've spent enough time in studios just watching people record and produce. And then as technology got a lot better, home recording became more accessible. I then began to write music for my classes, demoing them to my students, but I would never tell them that it was my music. I'd always just try to write something, a long track, often a 25 or 30-minute track, just so that when you're teaching, you don't have to keep looking down on your phone and changing the track. I could put on one track and it would last 20 minutes long. So I started writing my own songs in that length, which is really hard at first. So you can imagine it's hard enough to write a 2 or 3 minute track. Try writing a 20-minute one by also being a very novice, quote-unquote, engineer or producer. I wouldn't even call myself that. I still struggle with that. But I was trying and had to start somewhere. And I started demoing these songs in my classes, and no one would ever really say anything. I'd get the odd person saying, "Oh, that was nice music." But to me, if nobody said anything, meant that it was good enough to not be distracting. And if you practice yin or restorative yoga or meditation, silence is usually golden, which is funny because this is called Golden Hour. But in a lot of ways, sometimes having no music is better than none. But it is also beautiful when you can have really nice, supportive music that is non-distracting be part of your practice as you go inward. And from this became how I started getting into this genre. And naturally, writing in this genre made me listen more in this genre as well. So that's a little bit of background information of how and why I started. Thank you for listening to my TED Talk. I will now get into music. So as you may know, I am from Toronto, and there's no better way than to kick off my very first episode of Golden Hour with one of my favorite ambient music artists, and he is from Toronto. Here is the music of Alaskan Tapes. From his latest album, Who Tends a Garden, here is my favorite track on the album, Then.